Hey y'all, we're back on the School of Millennial podcast, and today I want to talk about why we as millennials are often misunderstood. We get labeled as being lazy, as being coddled and afraid of adulting, doing things like getting married, having kids, buying homes, starting businesses, being good employees, showing up for work, not job hopping, but being consistent employees, and the list goes on. Obviously, millennials are blamed for everything. We're killing everything from marriage to bank accounts to housing. And according to experts, we really have no reason to be hopeful about our present or our future. And yes, in a lot of ways, we have been screwed. That is indisputable. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast. But what I don't accept is this idea that we are all of those things I just listed. Yes, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are a lot of lazy millennials, and there are a lot of coddled millennials, and there are a lot of millennials who are totally unmotivated. But that's true in any generation and every age group and every demographic. So to generalize an entire generation, I think not only is false, but it's also damaging. It's damaging to the confidence that a lot of us have. And it also puts a false and misleading spin on why we are who we are. And quite honestly, as somebody who is personally always tired and always feels like I'm working and that I live at work, it's also insulting. And I'm not the exception. I know a lot of people in my peer group who feel the same exact way. And honestly, that's also the culture we live in. But a lot of us millennials were also raised to believe that we would only succeed in life if we worked really, really hard to the point of exhaustion, and that we were not working hard enough if we were not exhausted and stressed out, quite frankly. And this is pretty damaging to the psyche and also to your quality of life, which is something that I think a lot of us have realized as we've gotten older, especially those of us who've done basically everything we were told we needed to do to make it in life and achieve the American dream, only to realize that maybe that dream no longer exists. So obviously, a lot of people who listen to this podcast know I'm a journalist. I'm a TV reporter by day. I've been a newsie for my entire career. One of my favorite news organizations is NPR. And there's a great article in their business section, which actually comes from the transcripts of NPR's daily economics podcast called The Indicator from Planet Money. And the hosts, Cardiff Garcia and Sally Herships, interview an expert, Gray Kimbrough, who's an economist at American University. And he's kind of known, at least according to the Washington Post, as a serial millennial myth debunker. Now, this episode was recorded back in October, and they start where a lot of experts who pontificate about millennials start, which is the economy. And of course, we know that millennials are roughly ages 22 to 38, which is debatable depending on who you ask, but generally that's the thinking. And so what they do is they look at how the economy has changed in the last several decades, right? So, for example, Gray looks at the average amount that the U.S. economy has grown in the 10 years after each member of a generation reached the age of 18. And what they found is in the 10 years after millennials reached the age of 18, the economy has grown by an average of 18%. For both Gen X and the boomers, however, it grew by about twice that much when members of those generations turned 18. Then the host looked at when adults started moving out of their parents' homes. And young adults, it showed that in general, steadily had been moving out of their parents' houses at later and later ages, starting in the 60s and 70s. But the delay started to significantly increase around the year 2000, when the first millennials were around 18 or 19 years old. And the expert, Kimbrough, he says young women and men in their 20s are more likely to live with their parents now than at any time since World War II. Turns out there's a similar trend of young adults living in their own homes as opposed to renting, starting in the middle of the last decade after the U.S. housing market collapsed and dragged the rest of the economy down with it, there was this huge drop in the amount of people in their 20s who lived in a home that was owned rather than a home that was rented. So the economist Greg Kimbrough, he says that the most likely reason for this is that young adults have been living at home longer and putting off buying houses in this economy. And also the age when young adults get married is also increasing. That has also been a steady trend since the 1960s, however. Then, add to that, a much larger amount of millennials are going to college and graduating than people from earlier generations. So, the amount of college debt has also increased significantly since the middle of the last decade. So, of course, this makes it harder for us millennials to be able to afford homes, right? So economist Greg Kimbrough, he makes the point that when you take all of these things into consideration, the idea that the reason millennials and young adults are perhaps not adulting as efficiently as their parents or previous generations and not doing things like buying homes and having kids at the rate that previous generations did does not match the stereotype that we are lazy, self-absorbed, unmotivated, we only want instant gratification, and we don't work hard. And there's one more thing that the economist, he makes mention of, and that is the myth that millennials are also not good employees, which I mentioned earlier as another stereotype, that we hop from job to job and we can't commit to one career path or at least to excelling in one career path. Kimbrough says this is also nonsense, and to prove it, he makes the point that millennials and young adults now switch jobs at much lower rates than Gen Xers and baby boomers did when they were young. And there's one other point that the hosts Cardiff Garcia and Sally Herships make, and that is the point that there is a message of hope in all of this, right? So the fact that millennials are graduating with more college degrees than prior generations, we have actually set ourselves up to become the more productive members of our economy for the long term. And because we as millennials endured the financial crisis at a pretty young and impressionable age, it's also possible that we as a generation are going to be less likely to inflate a huge housing market bubble or cause some other big financial bubble from buying things that we can't afford, because we know in very real and often painful terms exactly what kind of consequences those things lead to. And it's possible that this would make economic growth more sustainable in the long run. And then perhaps instead of blaming millennials for being lazy and putting off adulthood, maybe we can actually start to appreciate millennials as the generation that actually corrects perhaps the bad financial habits that our predecessors instilled in our society. So yes, instead of ruining our economy, millennials might actually be the ones to save it. How do you like that? So anyway, I encourage you to check out this article. It's great. Listen to the episode if you can. I love NPR, and I love this idea that, yes, while millennials have shortcomings like every other generation and age group, actually, there's a reason we are the way we are and we do the things that we do. And in spite of all that, we're actually pretty awesome, and we may turn out to be America's heroes after all. So take that. All right, go forth and be great. See ya.